wanted to make a very quick video on fair value gaps. This is something I've back tested myself. Let's get straight to the point. The theory of which I've got, which is not really a theory, is that fair value gaps tend to get hit during the AM session a lot more than any other time. I specifically used the 4-hour time frame. If we go back to, let's say, 2021, I'm just going to showcase to you something that you should definitely back test yourself. This has personally changed my trading, my accuracy, my logic, my mindset when it comes to price action. So the details of the backtesting I'm requesting you to perform is to focus on the 4-hour time frame. You can obviously break this down onto the 1 hour and the 5 minute. I do have more detailed timestamps when it comes to the swing points I'm going to talk about. But when it comes to the 4-hour, I'm going to keep it simple for this video. I want you to go back in time, go on the 4-hour and focus on 1 a.m., 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. 1, 5 and 9. Now the reason why I'm going to explain that to you here. Swing point number 1, it's at 1 a.m. You can clearly tell that has reached for something of which it has then rejected away from. The other detail I want you to focus on whilst doing this is that during London session, which would be the high or the low of the day typically, you'd want to wait for 2 a.m. to pass, as that 2 a.m. will typically be the manipulation in London. The same applies to New York, which would be 7 a.m. You'd want to wait for the first hour of those sessions. But that's just something to keep in mind. It's not the crucial part of what I'm about to show you. Now, in this specific case, there isn't a gap here on the 4-hour. But if you are knowledgeable enough and you know how the markets book and they work, this is definitely a gap on the 1 hour for sure. I'm unable to show you that there is one on the 1 hour. If you are somehow able to see that there's a gap here on the 1 hour, just go back to that time frame and you'll be able to see that right here, there's a gap. Either on the 1 hour, 2 hour, 30 minute, whatever. The swing point right there has directly been hit into that gap. And the time is 1 a.m. Keep that in mind. Now, the next gap hit is once again right here on 9 a.m. At 9 a.m. we see a retracement into the gap and then a displacement away. A retracement again and then a displacement away. I know that's very simple and brief, but I just want to show you once again the timestamps of which I talked to you about. This is for 9 a.m. A gap has been hit again after a swing high. After that, we've got another 9 a.m. candle right here, retracing into another gap. Exact same thing, just right there, and then displacing away from it. After this, we have the 1 a.m. candle disrespecting the gap, which is rare, but it does happen based on data. You can back test this yourself. The 5 a.m. candle taps into it. We have tapped into it generally from 1 a.m. or 5 a.m. and we pushed away from it. There's a general reaction from a swing point. The next 1 a.m. candle on the right here, hits another gap. 1 a.m. candle displaces away. Within the next day, we actually have multiple events occurring at the same time. So for example, 1 a.m. does not reach the gap yet. 5 a.m. doesn't reach it either, but 9 a.m. right here does. And once it does, it goes all the way down 9 a.m., which is the timestamp of which I gave you to note down. It goes down to another gap, which is in 1 a.m. right here, and the space is away from it, all the way up. 5 a.m. once again has a swing high here, which isn't random. There isn't a gap on the 4-hour here, but there will definitely 100% be one on the 1 hour, 30 minutes, 2 hour, whatever. 5 a.m. right here is reaching for something, which has to be a gap over there. The exact same thing happens here. 9 a.m. reaches for something of which there is a gap here, but you can't see it on the 4-hour. Let me just say before I continue, if you truly want me to go to these price points, I can do that and show you what I'm talking about. I just want to show you on this chart alone. Moving on to 5 a.m. once again, it taps into another gap right here, the 5 a.m. candle, and the space is down a little bit, not too much. The next 1 a.m. candle, which is just the next day, we actually retrace all the way up, filling a imbalance that hadn't been created yet. So it has completely balanced out that gap that was about to be created. But we will ignore that. Let's just say that it didn't work there. That's fine. Moving on to the next candle right here, 9 a.m. candle, goes all the way down to this gap on the left, 4-hour. The space is up. And then we have 2 other candles, which are PM, going back into it, but those are irrelevant because we wouldn't be trading those. The next candle is once again 1 a.m. comes back into the same exact fair value gap. The space is away. 1 a.m. candle into a 4-hour gap on the left. Within the next few candles, I don't have historical data on the left. Moving on to a range where I do have historical data. 9 a.m. candle once again reaches upwards towards a gap on the left, which happens to be at 1 a.m. actually. 5 a.m. candle pushes down, rejects a little bit away from the gap, and then 9 a.m. comes back down, rejects a little bit more away from the gap. Then we have another 5 a.m. candle swinging down towards something which on the left we can't see. On the 4-hour chart, there isn't a gap here, but there will be one on the 1 hour. You can test this yourself. Moving on to the next day, 1 a.m. candle taps into another gap, rejects away, displaces up. 5 a.m. actually does the exact same thing, comes back down to the same exact gap, displaces away. Moving on to the very next day after that, 1 a.m. candle comes back into a gap the exact same way that we did here, the space is away up. And if you see on the left, New York 9 a.m. tends to reverse a lot. As you can tell, 9 a.m. reaches up into another gap, then the space is back down. And then guess what happens the very next day? 5 a.m. candle reaches all the way down into that exact original gap that we were talking about in the beginning. The space is all the way up. 9 a.m. then does the exact same thing we had happen the previous day, which is reverse away from this gap, pushing in the spacing all the way down. 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. candle tapping into a gap, disrespecting it. Like I said, that's rare, but it does happen. And when it does, this is what you'll see. 9 a.m. reversing down after tapping into a gap. 5 a.m. candle pushing down into a disrespected gap, which like I said, it does keep happening, but these things will keep retracing. Taps into a claimed fair value gap, which has been disrespected, and then the space is up. 5 a.m. candle comes down into a gap right there, which you can't see it on the 4 hour. There will be one on the 1 hour. High of the very next day's 5 a.m. candle right here goes all the way across to the left, hitting a gap on the 4 hour right there. And then the spacing all the way down. 5 a.m. candle the very next day after that does the exact same thing with 9 a.m. hitting it again and then reversing all the way down. Just one day later, ignoring this day because nothing really happened on the 4 hour. It definitely did happen on the 1 hour for sure, but let's ignore that and say that it didn't work, right? Let's just be fair. On the 1 a.m. candle right here, 5 a.m. taps into the gap on the left and the space is up. 9 a.m. taps again and reverses. 159. The very next day we get 9 a.m. tapping into the gap, and then the candle after that, which is 1 o'clock, continuing the reversal. The exact same thing did happen, but not at the timestamps I gave you. You can do whatever you want with that information. The very next day, 9 a.m. candle taps into a gap, reverses all the way up into spaces. The very next day after that, we have again the 9 a.m. candle right here tapping into a gap, not disrespecting it, all the way down, wicking away into spacing a little bit up, not a full displacement clearly. Moving on forward, the reason why we see a very wicky candle right here is because we are tapping into a lower time frame fair value gap up here, and there will be a lower time frame fair value gap down here, typically on the 1 hour, typically on the 30 minutes, and that's why 1 a.m. is going up and down. Same reason for 5 a.m., same reason for 9 a.m. Moving on to the next day, we can clearly see the 5 a.m. came down into a gap that hadn't been created yet. On the 1 hour, there will definitely be one that we have retraced into, but once again, 5 a.m. is reaching into something. And then we finally, after all of those examples, have the first 9 a.m. candle, or these AM candles, 1, 5, and 9, of which we reject away from, but then it comes back into it and doesn't actually respect it. We barge right through it. So out of all of the examples I've just given, this is the first one. The concept and the theory I'm explaining doesn't work properly. Now, I've also not considered other time frames. I haven't considered the daily. I haven't considered the weekly. I'm just speeding through this with the 4 hour. The 4 hour is my bread and butter. That's why I use the most. There's a gap right there on the 4 hour going all the way to the right. We can clearly see 5 a.m. candle taps into it, rejects all the way down. 9 a.m. candle reverses away from this gap right here, goes all the way up. And then we have 1 a.m. doing the exact same thing from the exact same gap, pushing down after rejecting away from it. 5 a.m. then taps into this gap, ping pong, goes up, down, goes from the top to the bottom of this gap. And then 9 a.m. reverses all the way up, taps into that gap again, and then we push all the way down into this gap. On the next day, we have 1 a.m. tapping into this gap, going all the way up there, down to this location right here. This would be the second time that doesn't properly work, although this would be a break even at most if you traded it, because price comes all the way here, you get a displacement halfway, retracement, and then by the time that you get a gap as a sign that you should put your stop loss to break even, you would hit break even. So this is why the thing I'm teaching you is very good to keep in mind and backtest. Anyways, the gap gets disrespected overall, which is rare, but it does happen, like I keep saying. And then we have 5 a.m. candle, wicks into that gap, reaches for something, and then the space is all the way down. We then struggle to maintain this push for a little bit towards the end of that 5 a.m. candle's lifespan, because there's a gap here, which we have not disrespected just yet. And then we end up disrespecting that gap, or you can call this a full rebalance based on the context of the higher time frame. 1 a.m. candle right here reaches down a little bit into this gap right there, just at the entrance of it. And then the space is all the way up. And then we have 9 a.m. candle coming into this gap right there and reversing all the way up again after retracing down. 9 a.m., 1 a.m., 1 a.m. candle the next day. We tap into a gap right here, push all the way down. It does not sustain the push. 5 a.m. does the exact same thing again. It does not sustain the push. 9 a.m. does the exact same again. It does not sustain the push. But as you can tell, and this is as obvious and as clear as it can get, 1 a.m., 5 a.m., 9 a.m., all 3 consecutive 4-hour candles reaching into what? The exact same gap. And there's a reason for it. Over the next 2 days, 1 a.m. candle taps into clearly a location where there would be a gap on the lower time frame, 1 hour, 2 hour. And so does 5 a.m., so does 9 a.m., where 9 a.m. typically reverses during New York, and clearly it does that. Sometimes don't even want to count these, but I'm just going to show it for the sake of it. 5 a.m. once again reaches into something, right? 5 a.m. significantly reaches into something, which there will be a gap here on the lower time frame. 9 a.m., fills the entirety of this previous gap, which then leads to reversal over the next 4 or 8 hours. The very next day, 5 a.m. reaches into what? Another gap over here, pushes all the way down, displaces. The very next day, we have 1 a.m. reaching into something. What is that something? Not a gap on the 4-hour time frame, but there will be a gap on the 1-hour time frame right here. 100% sure. 5 a.m. expands all the way up. We then have 9 a.m. hitting a gap again, and then reversing down onto this gap that we created, ping pong. The second phase of what I just explained was actually the 1 a.m. candle for the next day. The 1 a.m. candle taps into a gap. 5 a.m. tries to displace up, but it struggles because there's a gap on the other side. 9 a.m. does not even struggle. And then what does 9 a.m. typically tend to do? Reverse at the very end of it. So right here, you can tell there's a huge wick and price action has pushed down. There will be a gap here on the 1 hour. 1 a.m. once again reaches down into something. What is it? On the left, there's a gap. It does not disrespect the gap. It does wick into it, however. 5 a.m. tries to expand up and it struggles. 9 a.m. tries to hit a gap on the left, which there isn't on the 4 hour. Anyways, moving on. 9 a.m. candle right here does what? Once again, reaches into a fair value gap on the left and then reverses all the way down, of which the next day we then get 1 a.m., 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. Once again, both of these candles and their wicks tapping into what? Another fair value gap. But the thing is, when 1 a.m. tapped into one, 5 a.m. expanded into another gap right there, which you can tell that there will be one on the 1 hour. And then what did 9 a.m. do? Reverse down. We then have 1 a.m. do the exact same thing onto the exact same location, which I said there would be a gap there on the lower time frame. 1 a.m. expands, 5 a.m. expands, 9 a.m. does what? Reverse. And what's the reason for a reversal? Gap. 1 a.m. then comes into this gap, fails to expand on the other side, which is about the second or the third time this doesn't work. Just keep count with me. And then the very next day, we have 1 a.m. do what? Reach to another gap. 5 a.m. doing what? Delivering to the other gap on the other side. 9 a.m. tries to expand all the way up, reaches this gap, and clearly we struggle to break into it or past it. And then we reverse all the way down within the next few candles. And guess what happens the very next day again? 1 a.m. taps into another gap. 5 a.m. expands all the way down. 9 a.m. struggles to expand all the way down, and then we have 1 p.m. expanding all the way down, creating this huge gap, which, if you haven't caught up with what I'm teaching you so far, guess what happens the very next day? 1 a.m. taps into the gap, expands all the way down. 5 a.m. expands, 9 a.m. expands, and then past 9 a.m. we get a little retracement, not full reversal. Oh, but you thought I was done, right? You thought I'm finished with all of this, right? 1 a.m. taps into the gap that just got created. 5 a.m. expands all the way down. 9 a.m. tries to expand even further. They both fail, but regardless, we've got a huge move right there. And where's the move to? Exactly inside of this gap right here. Boom, right there. Anyways, moving forward, just so I can convince you that what I'm talking about is not a lie and it's just proof. 1 a.m. comes into the exact same gap we just delivered into, reaches down, then displaces up. 5 a.m. comes back into this gap that has not yet to be created, and then displaces even further up. The very next day, what does 5 a.m. do? Reaches into this gap and then displaces all the way up. And then what does 9 a.m. do? The very next day, 1 a.m. comes back into the gap we just created to then displace up at 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. where I've been saying 9 a.m. tends to reverse. But how does it reverse? There's a gap on the left which reverses all the way down. Where does it stop? At the gap we just created, which we just started from. Ping pong. The very next day, we've used the exact same gap to start with, and then the exact same way to displace all the way up at 5 a.m. But then New York to reverse at 9 a.m. Oh, but that's not enough. But don't worry, I've got more proof. The exact same day, you can literally tell 3 pillars of the exact same movement originating from the exact same source, leading to the exact same delivery, coming back to it, going back to it, coming back to it, going back to it. 5 a.m. reaching into a gap. 9 a.m. reversing from that gap, pushing into where? Within this last candle's lifespan, this gap that we started with in the beginning. We can then see a little move from that gap again, 5 a.m. here onto 9 a.m. The very next day, right here, tapping into a gap on the left, 9 a.m. reversing all the way up, struggling to expand up. That's clear sign that EURUSD is not looking to push up, and that would be maybe a fourth fail if you don't manage your trade well. The very next day, 5 a.m., we tap into the gap, we retrace up, and we don't expand again, and that's fine. Oh, would you look at that? The next day, 1 a.m., we reach into something. What's that something on the left? If we go in the 4-hour gap, then we go back to that candle. 1 a.m. reaches into it, 5 a.m. expands, then what does 9 a.m. do? Reverse. And where do we reverse to? That gap. The exact same thing that just happened here. Honestly, I don't even want to continue this video. I just want to show you something, because I see all these people teaching breaker blocks, mitigation blocks, order blocks, rejection blocks. And apparently ICT hasn't even released all of the arrays. There's apparently 72 arrays. And I'm here to tell you that's just bullcrap. What I just showed you, backtest 1 a.m., 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. Find out what they tend to do. I just gave you a hint. If you think what I just gave you is impressive, just back test it yourself. Look at what 1 a.m. is likely to do. Look at what 5 a.m. is likely to do. Look at what 9 a.m. is likely to do. And understand the reason why these things happen up and down into gap to gap is because the market is constantly trying to offer a fair opportunity to buyers and sellers. If the market pushes all the way down like this candle right here on the 4 hour, the market has to come back to rebalance orders within this push down and offer a buying and selling opportunity for both parties to then liquidate and push even further down, or perhaps having pushed from a discount fair value gap on the left to then disrespect this one. And the reason why these things happen during these times is because that's where the most news happens. If you check Forex Factory, you'll see that most days news will be during AM New York. There will rarely be PM news. Of course there are PM news, but during the day and the sessions, the kill zones, London and New York, you will see the things I just showed you. I want you to back test it and prove me wrong. I'm not trying to pull an ICT. I genuinely mean it. Back test it and prove me wrong. I don't sell you anything at the moment. Everything I post is for free. And the things I just explained, I've spent a long time back testing. Go through with this, back test it, 1 a.m., 5 a.m., 9 a.m., and come back to me and tell me what you find out. I'm simply doing this video because I'm sick and tired of these people posting secret strategies, 90% win rate strategies, a strategy that can guarantee you 7R, and learning data ranges, learning order blocks, learning rejection blocks, learning the golden ratio, learning OTE, learning what else? What else is it? How many terms do we have to learn? How many more terms are out there? Because I'm sick and tired of all of them. I'm sick. Just back test what I've just given you and your trading will change. I guarantee you. Take care.